Leora Dane didn't remember applying for any prestigious internships. Between her full-time class load, a part-time job in the dusty back room of the campus archives, and the relentless pressure of making rent on time, she barely had time to sleep, let alone submit a resume to one of the most powerful investment firms in New York. So when the envelope arrived, heavy, thick, cream-colored with gold-lettered stationery, she assumed it was a mistake. The name on the front was hers, spelled correctly, addressed precisely to her dorm mailbox. She held it in her hand for several minutes before opening it, expecting perhaps an invitation intended for someone else. What she found inside instead was an invitation. Formal, brief, and startlingly direct. You are invited to a private interview for a temporary assistant position at Kieran Wesson Capital. Location and time enclosed. Confidentiality required. Dress professionally. She almost threw it away. It felt too strange, too unreal, and most of all, too tailored to her. But curiosity got the better of her, as it often did. She researched the company later that night. Kieran Wesson was everything the letter had implied. Colossal, elusive, and rumored to be run by a man known as much for his ruthlessness as for his brilliance. Sutton Keir. There were no casual interviews with Sutton Keir, no internships, no grad programs. He hired like he invested, quietly, selectively, and with finality. Still, something about the letter gnawed at her. The timing, the tone, the audacity of it. It read like a command, not a request. She wasn't sure if she was being manipulated or offered something rare. But for a girl with no backup plan, very little to lose, and a sharp mind constantly undervalued, the idea of stepping into a world where she could be seen differently was enough to tip her over. The location wasn't a corporate office tower or a glass-paneled meeting room. It was a hotel. Not just any hotel, but a historic building in Midtown that had been converted into a private executive club. No signs. No lobby music. Just a discreet doorman who nodded at her as if he'd been waiting. She was escorted to a quiet room on the 10th floor. No windows, only soft light, and one long mahogany table in the center. There were no assistants, no introductions, no panel of interviewers. Just one man sitting at the head of the table, writing something in a black leather notebook. Sutton Keir. He didn't look up at first, and when he finally did, he studied her without speaking. She had dressed conservatively, in the only decent blouse she owned, and a black skirt she had borrowed from her roommate. Her hair was tied back. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, and she knew that, but her presence was composed. She didn't smile. She didn't fidget. She waited. He closed the notebook slowly and set his pen down. "You're early," he said. She nodded once. "You invited me. I assumed that mattered." He tilted his head slightly. "Good." That was the end of the pleasantries, if they could even be called that. He motioned for her to sit, and she did across from him, spine straight, heart pounding. But she didn't let it show. "I've read everything about you," he said. "School records, writing samples, your history with the debate team, your essays, your financial aid profile, your job history." He paused. "Your lack of social media is either strategic or the result of someone who doesn't like being seen." "I don't like being misunderstood," she replied evenly. He smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. "Do you know why you're here? I assumed you were going to tell me." "I could," he said, leaning back in his chair, "but I'd rather see how you respond to not knowing." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she held his gaze and said, "I respond with caution and with questions." "Good. That's a rare combination." He folded his hands in front of him, elbows on the table. "This is not a job interview," he said. "This is an offer. A short-term agreement. You will serve as a private assistant to me directly. 30 days. Full access. Confidentiality is expected. You will observe everything, listen to everything, attend every meeting, every event, every closed-door discussion. You will not speak unless asked. You will not ask why, and you will not pretend to be something you're not. If you lie, I'll know. If you hesitate, I'll see it. If you try to impress me, you'll fail." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I don't need charm," he continued. "I need clarity, precision, silence when silence is necessary, and judgment when it's earned. You will be compensated beyond what your classmates can imagine. You will also be under pressure you are not used to. I won't ask again after today. Say yes, and the contract begins now. Say no, and you walk out, and we never speak again. Leora didn't move. She didn't blink. She had never met a man like him. Not because of his power, that was obvious. Not because of his reputation, that was expected. But because he was not trying to convince her. There was no manipulation in his offer. Only control. She weighed everything silently. Her stomach tightened, not from fear but from something sharper. Recognition. She had always known the rules of the world were written by men like him. Now one of them was inviting her into the room where those rules were made. She straightened her shoulders and said simply, "Yes." Sutton stood, walked to a cabinet behind him, and retrieved a document. "No copies," he said. "Read it, sign it, keep nothing." She did, and when she signed, he looked at her and said, "You start tomorrow, 6:45 a.m. sharp. Wear something that doesn't apologize for existing." Then he turned and walked out of the room. Lyra remained seated for several minutes after he left, the pen still in her hand, the weight of what she had done just beginning to land. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't watching from the edge. She had walked directly into the center. The next morning began before the sun had even considered rising. Lyra was already awake, dressed, and outside the building by 5:50 a.m., standing at the edge of the street with her coat pulled tightly around her. She hadn't slept much. Her mind had replayed every detail of the previous day on a loop. His words, his eyes, the tone of his voice that cut through her like a wire. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the raw, pressing tension of stepping into something much larger than she could predict. She had read enough about men like Sutton Keir to know they didn't hand out second chances. He meant it when he said the contract had already begun. At exactly 6:45 a.m., she stepped into the lobby of the Keir and Wesson building, a towering structure of brushed steel and black glass. It was still quiet, just the security staff and a few early risers. The receptionist barely looked up before scanning her name tag and directing her to the top floor. The elevator ride was smooth and silent, the kind that didn't play music or display floors. Just a single blinking light at the top, a small reminder that this floor wasn't available to the public. When the doors opened, she was greeted not by a secretary, but by silence. A long hallway with thick carpet led her toward a double glass door, and beyond it, a minimalist office that looked more like a high-end gallery than a workplace. Sutton was already inside, seated at his desk with a tablet in one hand and coffee in the other. He didn't look up right away. Leora stepped in, closing the door behind her quietly. He glanced at the clock on the wall, then at her. "You're 3 minutes early," he said. "That will serve you well." She didn't respond. She simply stood, waiting for instruction. He nodded once, approving her restraint. Then he motioned to a desk positioned at the far end of the room. Sleek, empty, waiting for her. "That's yours for now. All files are digital. Password is temporary. You'll change it by the end of the day. Anything you print, you shred. Anything you see, you remember. You'll take notes in every meeting, even if I don't ask. If I tell you to leave, you leave, no questions. If I pause, you watch. If I nod, you act. If you're unsure, say nothing." He stood then, walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the city. His movements were precise, almost mathematical, as if everything had been measured in advance. He didn't turn around when he spoke again. "Every assistant I've had before you had credentials, MBAs, years of executive support. They also had egos. They wanted to be seen, admired, heard. And one by one, they became liabilities." He turned to face her now, his eyes sharp but not cruel. "I don't need a shadow who wants the spotlight. I need someone with a mind that listens before it speaks, and instincts that understand timing. You have the potential, but potential is useless unless you're willing to be rewired." Leora felt the words hit somewhere deep in her chest. It wasn't praise, not really. It was a challenge, and it landed with weight. He moved back to his desk, typed something quickly, then turned the screen toward her. A calendar, booked solid, meetings back to back, some marked only with initials or coded numbers. He spoke as she studied it. "Today will feel like drowning. That's intentional. You'll observe. You'll absorb. You won't be asked to contribute, only to witness. The moment I see you trying to prove yourself, I'll know you're not ready." She nodded once. He seemed satisfied. Their first meeting was in a glass-walled conference room 3 floors down. She followed him silently, notebook in hand, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors. Inside, there were already 5 men in suits, mid-conversation, their laughter echoing off the glass. The moment Sutton entered, the room fell silent. Not out of fear exactly, but out of the kind of respect that bordered on wariness. Introductions were minimal. Leora wasn't acknowledged, and that suited her. She took a seat near the corner and began taking notes in shorthand, tracking shifts in tone, glances exchanged, numbers referenced too casually to be insignificant. Sutton spoke little, but when he did, every sentence was a final word. No one interrupted, no one pushed back. By the end of the first hour, she understood more about his world than she had anticipated. It wasn't just numbers and power plays, it was psychological warfare. Every phrase was a calculation. Every silence had a purpose. The day continued without pause. Meetings blurred into one another, with lawyers, analysts, media consultants. Through it all, Sutton never raised his voice, never showed impatience, but his standards were sharp enough to slice. One assistant from another department made the mistake of interrupting him with a correction. He dismissed her from the room with a single glance. During lunch, which was eaten in silence at his desk, he looked at Leora for the first time with something close to curiosity. "You're still here." She met his gaze calmly. "You haven't asked me to leave." He smirked, just barely. "Fair." Later that afternoon, they visited a private legal office. Leora sat in on a conversation about a potential merger. The stakes were high, hundreds of millions. At one point, Sutton asked for her notebook. She handed it to him without hesitation. He skimmed it, nodded once, and handed it back. "Your shorthand is efficient. Your observation about Finley's hesitation was correct. Don't assume I didn't notice you noticed." She felt a flicker of pride but didn't show it. She didn't smile. She simply kept writing. By the time the day ended, it was nearly 9 in the evening. The city outside was glowing in amber and cold light. Sutton dismissed her with a nod and a single sentence. "Tomorrow we start earlier." Leora left the building exhausted but alert, her brain buzzing with the details of a world she had only ever glimpsed from the outside. She didn't know exactly what she was being trained for, or why he had chosen her, but something in her had been awakened. Not just ambition, not just hunger, but the first flicker of transformation. Not into someone else, but into someone closer to who she might have always been. She didn't sleep much that night either, but she didn't toss or turn. She just lay still in the dark, her hands flat on the blanket, her mind racing, and her pulse steady. Ready. By the third day, the rhythm had started to form in Leora's body like a second pulse. She woke at 5 a.m. Without an alarm, brewed instant coffee in the shared dorm kitchenette, and stood under the weak fluorescent light in the hallway, straightening the blazer she'd worn 2 days in a row. Her shoes had begun to rub the skin near her ankles raw, but she said nothing. She didn't complain. There was no room for discomfort in a space ruled by precision. Everything about her life outside the Kieran Wesson building now felt blurred, irrelevant, like it belonged to someone else entirely. The girl who once panicked over grades, who ate in library corners, who avoided eye contact in seminar rooms, she was vanishing, little by little. In her place stood someone watching every word, measuring every silence, and learning a new language, the language of power. When she arrived that morning, Sutton was already at his desk. He didn't acknowledge her with words. Instead, he slid a small card toward her, face down. Leora picked it up and read a single word printed in clean, black font. Perception. "You'll be tested on that today," he said, eyes still on the screen in front of him. "Not what you do, but what you allow others to believe you are doing." He stood in motion for her to follow. There was no briefing, no further explanation. She fell into step beside him, notebook in hand, her heels muffled by the thick hallway carpet. They entered a side conference room this time, smaller, darker, with only one other person inside. A man in his late 40s, pale suit, expensive watch, the kind of smile that was too controlled to be sincere. Sutton didn't offer introductions. Leora sat down and took her pen out slowly, deliberately, as if to signal she wasn't in a rush to understand anything too early. The man leaned back in his chair and tapped the table twice with his fingers. "This is the new one?" he asked. "She doesn't have a name here," Sutton replied. Only purpose. Leora didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She let the words settle in the air like dust. She had no idea what the meeting was about. Real estate possibly, or asset extraction. But she began taking notes anyway, quietly recording tone, subtext, interruptions. Within 5 minutes, she knew the man wasn't listening to half of what Sutton said. He was performing, waiting to provoke. He used casual phrases like, "You understand me, don't you?" And "We both know how this game works," as if to assert they were equals. Sutton let him talk. Occasionally, he'd lean back and glance at Leora, not to speak, but to remind her, "Watch this." Halfway through the meeting, the man made a joke about Sutton's history with a particular failed fund. Sutton didn't react, but the temperature in the room changed. It was almost imperceptible. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't retaliate. He simply paused, leaned forward, and said in an almost clinical tone, "You don't need to impress me. You need to decide whether you can afford to pretend you're unimpressed." The silence that followed was so absolute, Leora stopped writing. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. Back in the office, Sutton finally looked at her. "What did you learn?" "That people project confidence when they're cornered," she said. "More. That you use quiet as a weapon." He studied her. "And what did you feel?" Leora hesitated, then answered, "That it's easier to respect you than to like you." That made him smile. A real one this time. Tight, but genuine. "You're not here to like me. That's why you're still here." For the next few hours, she shadowed him through back-to-back calls, silent in the corner as he paced and negotiated, his voice always calm, his language mercilessly efficient. He rarely raised his tone, but every word felt like it had been pre-selected to disarm or dominate. Leora had never seen anything like it. He wasn't charming, he wasn't warm, but he was magnetic in a way that made people try to outdo themselves just to keep up. Power didn't leak from him. It radiated inward, drawn from the control he never once surrendered. At noon, he handed her a file. "You're joining me for a private lunch. You'll sit, you'll listen, you'll be asked a question, one. You'll answer it precisely and then say nothing else." She nodded. The restaurant was quiet, discreet, nestled behind a lobby most people would walk past without noticing. Their table was already waiting. At it sat a woman in her 50s, elegant, sharp, with the posture of someone who didn't need to prove she was important. Sutton greeted her with a nod and gestured for Leora to sit beside him. No introductions again. The woman studied Leora for a moment and then turned back to Sutton. "Is this the girl?" "She's not a girl," Sutton said evenly. "She's a witness." The conversation that followed was dense. It danced around philanthropy, public exposure, legal navigation. Leora tracked every shift. When the woman finally turned to her, she asked, "And what do you think is the greatest risk in being near someone like him?" Leora didn't hesitate. "Believing the armor is the man." The woman looked amused. Sutton looked impressed. Afterward, in the car, he finally spoke again. "You don't flinch when tested," he said, "but be careful not to confuse clarity with safety. You see clearly, yes, but you are not safe." Leora turned to him and asked quietly, "From you?" "From proximity," he answered. That night, she sat at her desk back in the dorm, the city humming outside her tiny window. She was exhausted, but not in the way she used to be. Tired of doing too much for too little. Now she was tired from growing faster than her own sense of balance could keep up with. Each day chipped away at the version of herself she had brought into this world, and something new was being built in its place. Not for him, not even because of him, but because of what she was seeing about others, and most of all, about herself. By the fourth day, the tension between them had begun to evolve into something more difficult to name. It wasn't attraction in the obvious sense. There had been no flirting, no lingering glances, no suggestive comments, but something existed in the quiet spaces between their conversations, in the way Sutton's eyes occasionally lingered on Leora when she thought he wasn't looking, and in how she found herself anticipating not just his words, but the silence before them. There was a current building beneath the structure of their strictly defined arrangement, and though neither of them acknowledged it, both had begun to sense its weight. The morning began like the others. Lyra arrived early, her steps already confident, her notes from the day before revised and organized. She wore a dark gray dress that she had borrowed from a friend on her floor, something that made her feel older, less invisible. Sutton didn't comment on her appearance when she entered, but something flickered behind his eyes, brief and unreadable. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply said, "We're going to the Whitmore auction today. You'll stay close. No introductions, no reactions, just observe." The Whitmore auction was one of those events that didn't appear on social calendars, but decided the direction of influence in the city's upper echelons. Art, property, antique equity. It was less about the items themselves and more about who wanted to own what and why. Sutton wore a navy suit with no tie, the crisp collar of his shirt slightly open at the throat. He moved through the lobby of the venue like he belonged to every corner of it. Leora followed him closely, scanning faces, noting posture, tone, proximity, everything he had taught her to look for. He didn't introduce her to anyone, and no one asked who she was. They assumed she was someone who mattered to him, which in that world was enough to not be questioned. The auction itself was hosted in a private room filled with people who never had to explain their presence. Leora watched Sutton interact with a small group near the bar, all older men, all leaning slightly inward toward him, as if his attention were currency. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. A few short comments from him carried more weight than any of their attempts at banter. During a break in the bidding, Sutton returned to her side. He handed her a glass of water, not wine, not champagne, and said, "What did you see?" She answered without hesitation. "The man in the blue pinstripe suit is bluffing about his interest in the Van Cleef piece." He never made eye contact with the auctioneer. He only raised the card when he saw Miller do it. He gave her the slightest nod. "Good. What else?" The woman in red kept adjusting her earring when your name was mentioned. "She knows something, or thinks she does." His eyes met hers, and there was the briefest pause, one that hummed with something unspoken. He leaned in slightly, and though he didn't lower his voice, it felt quieter somehow. "You read rooms like people read books, but be careful. Knowing what people want is different from knowing what they'll do when they realize they can't have it." After the auction, they went to a late lunch in a quiet restaurant on the Upper West Side. It wasn't business-related. There were no contracts on the table, no calls to take. Just the two of them in a corner booth by a window, watching the slow movement of traffic and early afternoon light spilling across the floor. The energy between them shifted again, subtle but undeniable. He asked her what she wanted to do after law school, and she told him honestly, "I used to think I'd work for a nonprofit. Then I realized that wouldn't change anything. Now I think I want power before I try to fix the system." He smiled, not mockingly, not condescendingly, genuinely. Most people never admit that out loud. "I don't think I would have said it yesterday," she replied. There was a silence after that, a long one, but it wasn't awkward, it was full. That night, they returned to the office for a final round of review meetings. It was past 9 p.m. when they finished. The building was nearly empty. Leora gathered her notes and turned to leave when he spoke again, softly. "Stay a minute." She froze for a moment, then turned back. He was standing by the window, his hands in his pockets, staring down at the lights of the city. "I don't normally ask people to stay." "I know," she said. "You don't have to explain." "I'm not trying to," he replied. "I just need a moment of quiet that isn't empty." She didn't fully understand what he meant, but she didn't question it. She walked to the opposite side of the office and sat on the small couch beneath the bookshelves. No more words were exchanged. He didn't move closer. She didn't ask anything. They simply existed in the same space, breathing the same air, both too tired to analyze the thing that was forming between them, but too aware to pretend it wasn't there. It was nearing midnight when she finally rose to leave. He looked at her then, not with command, not with cool detachment, but with a kind of gravity that felt new. She waited for him to say something, to offer a line that would cut or clarify, but he didn't. He only said, "I'll see you tomorrow." Leora left the office feeling altered in a way she couldn't describe. Nothing explicit had happened. No boundaries had been crossed. But everything between them was different now. The space between their silences had narrowed. The rules had not been broken, but they had been bent. And both of them knew it. On the fifth day, the weather broke. Rain fell steadily over the city, turning the sidewalks slick and dark, washing the glass windows of high-rises like someone trying to wipe away fingerprints left by too many secrets. Lyra walked into the building without an umbrella, the sleeves of her coat soaked, her hair damp at the ends. She didn't care. The physical discomfort was easier to manage than the internal dissonance she'd been feeling since last night. Something between her and Sutton had shifted again, and while neither of them spoke about it, it sat between them now, dense and unacknowledged. She arrived at the top floor exactly on time. Sutton was already standing at the window, a mug in hand, watching the rain as if it were performing for him. The office was unusually still. No assistants, no calls coming through the intercom, no urgency humming beneath the surface. Just the quiet before something. He didn't look at her as he spoke. "We won't be in the office today. Get your coat. I'll explain in the car." She hesitated only briefly before nodding. The car was already waiting downstairs, sleek and black with tinted windows. Inside, Sutton sat with a file open across his lap. His expression was neutral but distant, as though his mind was already several miles ahead. He didn't speak until they were halfway across the city, caught in traffic near the Upper East Side. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said, without turning to her. "She knows me better than anyone," which is both a compliment and a threat. Leora looked at him, searching for a clue in his voice, but he gave none. He continued flipping through the file in his hands, reading with surgical attention, his mouth drawn into a hard line. She recognized that look. It was the one he wore before something he didn't want to do. They arrived at a private brownstone, older and elegant, with ivy climbing the iron gate. The woman who opened the door was striking, not in a delicate way, but in the manner of someone who had long ago learned how to weaponize presence. Her features were sharp, her gray hair tied neatly back, and her eyes, dark and assessing, settled on Leora with immediate calculation. "You brought her," she said to Sutton, more observation than greeting. "She brought herself," he replied simply. The woman's lips curved slightly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She turned and led them inside, through a sitting room filled with books and old paintings, into a study that smelled faintly of ink and cedar wood. Lyra remained standing until the woman gestured for her to sit. "I'm Adelaide Shaw," she said, finally offering her name. "I used to be engaged to this man, which means I know better than to assume I ever really had him." Sutton said nothing, only leaned back in his chair and watched. Adelaide turned her attention fully to Leora now, studying her in the same way Sutton sometimes did. Not for weakness, but for layers. "How long have you been working with him?" "5 days," Leora said. "And how long have you been wondering what exactly he's trying to make you into?" Leora met her gaze evenly. "Maybe the question is whether he's making me into something or finally letting me be it." That response landed like a small detonation. Adelaide's expression didn't change much, but a flicker of something, surprise maybe, passed through her eyes. Sutton didn't look at Leora, but she felt his attention shift toward her like heat. "I underestimated you," Adelaide said. "I get that a lot," Leora replied quietly. The conversation turned then, but Leora understood what the meeting had been. It wasn't business. It wasn't personal either. Not in the ordinary sense. It was a test. Not from Sutton, but from someone who had once stood where Leora now did. She realized something else too. Sutton hadn't brought her to prove anything. He'd brought her to see if she could hold her own. And she had. Back in the car, the silence was heavier. "She's not someone I introduce people to," Sutton said eventually. "I figured. She doesn't like being surprised, but she respects accuracy." "You were accurate." Leora turned her head toward the window, watching the city flicker by under the rain. "Why did you really take me there?" she asked after a while. He didn't answer right away. Then softly, "Because I wanted to see what I look like through someone else's eyes." Later that evening, back at the office, the energy between them was different. It wasn't warmer exactly. If anything, it was more volatile, more charged. At one point, Leora brought him a folder and their fingers touched. It was brief, incidental, but neither of them pulled away quickly. She felt the pause in him and the pause in herself. A quiet, conscious recognition of something they were both now pretending wasn't there. Before she left, he spoke again. "Don't mistake this for something it isn't." She turned to him, her voice calm. "I'm not mistaking anything. I see it exactly as it is." He studied her, as though weighing what she meant. Maybe he already knew. Maybe that was what unsettled him. That night, alone in her room, Leora opened her notebook and wrote nothing. She stared at the blank page for almost an hour, the pen resting against her fingers, unmoving. Her mind felt full but untouchable. She couldn't process the day in words. She could only feel the strange ache of being seen by someone who demanded more of her than anyone else ever had, and who, despite everything, somehow made her feel less alone in the process. The sixth day started with stillness. The rain from the previous night had passed, leaving behind a city washed clean, its streets dark with moisture, its skies overcast but calm. Lyra walked through the lobby of the Kier & Wesson building with her head high, her expression unreadable, her heels clicking steadily against the marble floor. By now, the security guards no longer glanced at her twice. The receptionist didn't ask for her name. Her presence was no longer a question. It was an expectation. She took the elevator to the top floor and entered the office just as the clock struck 6:45. Sutton wasn't at his desk. The room was dimmer than usual, the lights over the bookshelves off, the blinds still closed. For the first time all week, there was no agenda waiting for her on the table, no file, no schedule on the screen. The silence in the space was thicker than usual, weighted by something that hadn't yet revealed itself. She stood for a moment, unsure whether to wait or move. Then she heard the door behind her open. He stepped in, wearing a dark gray coat, slightly damp at the edges, and a black scarf still wrapped around his neck. His hair looked less styled, as though he'd been walking for a while. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Uncertainty, or maybe exhaustion. Not the physical kind, but the kind that came from living too long in your own armor. "I walked here," he said finally, setting his coat over the back of a chair. No driver, no calls, no instructions. Leora nodded slowly. "Because you needed to think?" "No," he said, "because I needed to feel something real." She didn't answer. She wasn't sure how to. That statement didn't belong to the version of him she had known so far. This wasn't the sharp, composed, untouchable man who ruled boardrooms and dismantled opponents with words. This was someone standing just slightly outside the limits of his own rules. He walked past her to the window and opened the blinds. The city stretched out before them, gray and silent. He looked at it for a long time before turning back to her. "There are things you should know," he said. "Not because they're relevant to your role, but because they're relevant to the fact that you're still here." Leora stayed still, waiting. She had learned by now that silence was not only a tool with Sutton, it was a form of trust. He gestured for her to sit, and they both did, facing each other across the low table by the windows. No desk, no buffer. "I wasn't supposed to run this company," he said. "I didn't build it for myself. I built it to prove I could build it. There's a difference. My father worked until the day he died and left behind nothing but debt and silence. I wanted to create something no one could take from me. Something that didn't rely on charm or luck or anyone else's approval." Leora listened, her gaze steady, her hands folded in her lap. "I thought if I made myself invaluable, I could never be vulnerable," he continued. "But that's the lie, isn't it? You don't lose power when you're betrayed. You lose it when you let someone close enough to matter." She understood now. This wasn't confession for the sake of connection. This was an explanation. He was trying to make sense of himself out loud, to someone who didn't yet owe him anything. "I've pushed people out for less than what you've seen," he said, "but I haven't pushed you. Because I haven't tried to take anything from you," she said quietly. He looked at her. "You've taken more than you realize." She felt her pulse spike, but she didn't show it. She kept her expression calm, collected, though something in her chest began to tighten. He stood then and walked to the far wall where a series of abstract paintings hung in muted tones. He looked at them without really seeing them. "There's a limit to what I can be to people," he said, "but I keep noticing that you're not asking for anything. Not reassurance, not definition. You're just here, and that's more disarming than anything else." The words lingered between them, neither fully intimate nor impersonal. He turned back to her and took a breath, as if weighing whether to continue. Then with surprising vulnerability, he said, "When I'm with you, I stop thinking about who's watching." That confession broke something open in her, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, private shift. She had spent her entire life being invisible to most, underestimated by the rest. She had learned to navigate spaces by shrinking herself, by observing without being observed. And now, sitting across from this man who had built his entire world around control, she realized he had noticed her in ways no one else ever had. She stood slowly, her hands loose at her sides. "You don't have to be afraid of being seen, Sutton. Not by me." He looked at her, something in his expression unreadable. "You say that now?" "Because I mean it now," she replied. He took a step closer, just one. Not enough to touch, but enough to let the air between them change. He didn't reach for her. He didn't speak, and she didn't move. They stood in silence for a long moment, the kind that existed between one truth and the next. Then, as if remembering himself, he stepped back. "This changes things," he said. "Only if you want it to," she answered. He nodded slowly, then looked away. "Go home for the day. No agenda, no notes, just rest." She didn't argue. She gathered her things and left the office with her heart pounding in a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. Not from panic, not from fear, but from the sharp, clear ache of something that was beginning, and the knowledge that once it did, neither of them would be able to unsee it. The morning of the seventh day arrived with the same eerie stillness that had followed her out of the office the night before. The city outside was beginning to stir, horns breaking the silence, sidewalks filling with purpose. But Leora moved through it like a woman carrying something unspoken. The rain had passed, leaving the air cool and sharp. She took the subway instead of a cab, needing the anonymity of crowded spaces to collect herself, to fold her thoughts back into something manageable. The night had been sleepless, not from anxiety, but from restlessness. She had replayed Sutton's words again and again. "When I'm with you, I stop thinking about who's watching," and tried to tell herself not to read into them, not to let herself become the girl who heard meaning in fragments. But the truth sat too heavily in her chest to ignore. Something had shifted between them, and they had both felt it. When she arrived at the building, something felt different. Not in the air or the lighting or the hum of the reception floor, but in the way the guards looked at her. There was a slight pause when she passed through security, a flicker of recognition, not hostile, but aware, as if her presence now meant something more than just employment. Upstairs, the office was brightly lit. The blinds were drawn open, allowing light to pour in across the polished floor, and there was music playing, soft jazz, unexpected and strangely intimate. Sutton wasn't at his desk. Instead, he was standing in front of the long wall of windows, hands in his pockets, wearing a navy shirt, no jacket, sleeves pushed up. It was the first time she had seen him dressed down, and the effect was immediate. He looked younger, less composed, but somehow more grounded. She stood near the door, waiting for acknowledgement. He turned at the sound and offered a quiet, brief smile, one that didn't feel rehearsed. "Close the door," he said. She obeyed, and when she turned back to face him, he had moved to sit at the edge of the conference table, a folder beside him. "We have a problem," he said. "Or maybe more accurately, we have a decision to make." Leora stepped closer, her body still, her mind alert. He tapped the folder gently. "This is from the compliance office. They flagged your name." She blinked. "For what?" "Not for something you did," he said. "For something someone thinks you are." He handed her the file and she opened it slowly, scanning the contents. It wasn't an accusation, not formally. It was a summary of her presence, her arrival, her position, the fact that she had no prior corporate background, and yet was now shadowing the CEO on matters of extreme confidentiality. The language was careful, but the implication was clear. Someone suspected she was more than just an assistant. Leora closed the file and looked at him. "Who filed this?" "Adelaide didn't file it herself," he said. "But she doesn't need to. All she has to do is raise an eyebrow in the wrong hallway." Leora nodded slowly. She understood now. Last week's visit hadn't just been a test. It had been a warning. And Sutton, for all his control, hadn't been immune to the consequences of what she had passed. He stood and walked toward the window again, tension in his shoulders. "This is the point where I'm expected to create distance, to end the arrangement, to protect the company, the narrative, and myself." She didn't move. "But you're not doing that." He turned to face her again. "No, I'm not." There was something unguarded in his expression, something dangerously close to personal. "If I cut you out now, I send a message to everyone in this building that perception matters more than reality, that truth bends when pressure is applied, that the only way to survive here is to be afraid of being seen. And you're not afraid anymore, she asked. I am, he said, but I'm more afraid of becoming the man I used to be. They stood in silence, the music still playing softly in the background. Leora stepped forward, closer to him now, not to cross a line, but to close a distance that had already been breached by everything unspoken between them. Then what happens next, she asked. He exhaled slowly. We either pretend this is still just a job and continue under the illusion that neither of us is affected, or we stop pretending and accept that this, whatever it is real and that it changes everything. Leora felt her heartbeat quicken, but her voice remained steady. And what would that mean for me? It would mean more risk, he said. More scrutiny. You'd be watched, judged, pulled into politics you never asked to enter, and I wouldn't be able to protect you from all of it. But you'd try? She asked. His answer was quiet but immediate. Yes, she nodded. Then I'd stay. He stepped closer, slowly, cautiously, like a man unused to proximity without purpose. His hand didn't reach for hers and she didn't move to close the final space between them. But it didn't matter. The understanding between them was complete. There's a board meeting tomorrow, he said. They'll expect to see you gone. Then they'll be disappointed, she replied. He smiled, something small and private. For the rest of the day, they worked side by side as if nothing had changed. The meetings continued. The paperwork was reviewed. The calls were made. But everything was different. Their glances carried new weight. Their silences felt fuller. And somewhere in the spaces between their movements, something stronger began to settle. Not romance in the simple sense, but respect forged by fire. The awareness that they had both stood at the edge of comfort and stepped willingly into consequence. That night, after the office had gone dark and the building had begun to empty, Sutton paused by her desk before leaving. He didn't speak right away. Then he said, You know this doesn't get easier. Leora looked up at him, tired but steady. I'm not here because it's easy. He nodded once, slowly. Then he turned and walked out into the night. She remained at her desk for a long time, staring at the quiet screen, her reflection faint in the black glass. She wasn't the girl who had walked into that office a week ago. She wasn't even the girl who had signed the contract. She was something else now, sharper, harder, more certain of what she could handle. And the weight of that truth settled over her shoulders like a new kind of armor. Whatever came next, she wasn't waiting for permission to face it. The 8th day began with tension already in the air. It wasn't spoken aloud, but Leora could feel it in the way the receptionist avoided eye contact when she entered the building, in the hushed tones of the junior associates clustered in the lobby, and in the silent nod from security as she passed. Through the checkpoint, everyone knew what the day would bring. The board meeting had been scheduled weeks ago, but its meaning had shifted in the past 24 hours. Rumors traveled faster than memos in places like this, and Leora knew her name had likely passed through every corner office and under every breath. She wasn't a mystery anymore. She was a disruption, but she didn't hesitate. She took the elevator to the top floor, her shoulders square, her mind quiet. She had prepared for this, not with speeches or strategy, but with the clarity of someone who had already made her choice. She had stayed. And now she would face the cost of that decision without apology. Sutton was already in the office, seated at his desk, reviewing documents with the same calm precision he always carried. But there was something different in his eyes when he looked up and saw her. Not concern, not doubt, resolve. He gestured toward the table beside his desk, where a printed agenda had been laid out alongside a thick folder. She picked it up and began reviewing the contents without a word. They didn't speak for several minutes. There was no need. Everything necessary had been said the day before. At 9 a.m. sharp, the board convened in the main conference room, a space designed more like a courtroom than a collaboration hub. High-back leather chairs, a long gleaming table, massive screens set into the walls, and a panoramic view of the skyline that looked almost confrontational. Leora entered behind Sutton, her presence sparking a ripple of visible discomfort. Some faces masked it better than others, but she saw the glances. She heard the sudden silence. Her chair was not at the table but placed along the side wall, clearly meant to separate her from the formal proceedings. She sat there calmly, notebook in hand, eyes steady. The meeting began in the usual way: financial updates, quarterly reviews, planned investments. Sutton moved through it all with clinical efficiency, presenting numbers, dismantling objections, outlining growth with the same brutal clarity that had made him the company's cornerstone. But the tension in the room was growing. She could feel it building, gathering itself like a wave. It finally broke when one of the senior board members, a man named Chalmers, leaned forward, folding his hands with exaggerated calm. "Before we move on, I think it's worth addressing a matter of internal concern." Sutton didn't look surprised. He simply nodded once. "Go ahead." "There have been inquiries," Chalmers said, "about the presence of a non-executive assistant in sensitive meetings. A woman with no prior corporate experience who appears to have been granted unusual access and visibility within the company." Leora did not flinch. She kept writing, her hands steady. Sutton leaned back in his chair. "She has a name." Chalmers gave a tight smile. "Of course, Miss Dane. Though I'm not sure most people here would have known that until recently." Another board member spoke up. "This isn't personal, Sutton. It's about optics, about liability. The markets react to perception, not just policy. If there's a narrative forming outside this room that we can't control, it puts all of us at risk." Sutton was silent for a moment, then stood and walked to the head of the table, placing both hands on the smooth surface. "What puts this company at risk," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "is the belief that power must look a certain way, that it must speak with the same voice it always has, that it must wear the same face. I brought her into this room not because she's convenient or loyal or expendable. I brought her because she sees what none of you see anymore: the details, the patterns, the truth between the lines." He looked directly at Chalmers. "You want to talk about liability? Let's talk about how many deals we've nearly fumbled because no one in this room is willing to be questioned. She questioned me. That's why she's still here." The room fell quiet. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the building's air system. Then someone cleared their throat. A new voice. A woman from the legal team, younger than most of the others, but respected. "With respect," she said carefully, "if she's as capable as you claim, why not make it formal? Give her a title. Let her stand in the light instead of hiding her in the shadows and making her a target." Sutton looked at Leora. For the first time that morning, she spoke. "I didn't come here to be protected," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I came here to learn. But if you're offering a seat at the table, I won't decline it." Another silence. Another shift in air pressure. Sutton turned back to the board. "You have my answer. If anyone believes her presence compromises our integrity, you're free to bring it to a vote. But understand this: if she leaves, I leave." It was a line drawn with finality, one that shocked the room into complete stillness. No one spoke. No one moved. The meeting resumed after that, but it was quieter. No more challenges, no more posturing. Sutton continued as if nothing had happened, but Leora felt the new boundary that had been drawn around her. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't tolerated. She was seen. When they returned to the office later, Sutton sat at his desk and opened his laptop without a word. She stood nearby, still holding her notebook. Finally, he looked up. "You didn't have to speak." "I know. You did anyway. I needed them to hear my voice." He nodded slowly. "They'll come for you in other ways. Indirect, political, cold." She smiled faintly. "Let them." He studied her for a moment, then closed the laptop and stood. "I don't know what this becomes," or he said. "Us. This. But I know I don't want to go back to who I was before you walked into that interview room." She stepped closer, close enough to blur the lines between professional and something else entirely. "Then don't," she said. He reached for her hand, not commanding, not possessive, just a simple, quiet gesture, and she didn't pull away. Outside, the clouds began to lift, and for the first time in days, sunlight poured through the windows, cutting across the floor in golden streaks. Neither of them spoke again that afternoon, but everything that needed to be said was already alive in the space between them, earned, chosen, and finally unmistakably real.